Hello and welcome to the GeoCurrents series on global demography. Today's lecture is a relatively short one, but it's on an important topic, which is the Atlantic slave trade in the early modern period and the depopulation of sub-Saharan Africa. When we look at graphs on global population, we typically see something like this, showing population starting at a relatively low level and increasing continually and steadily, but at a low rate until sometime in the 19th century, and then moving upwards in an exponential fashion. Now, there's something to be said for graphs like this, but there are some problems as well. One is it is not at all clear that there was continual increase in the global population. For example, in the second half of the 1300s or 14th century, there was probably a decrease in global population due to the bubonic plague epidemic of the period. A more important issue, and the one I want to focus on today, is a bit different, which is that whereas globally it may be true that there was this general increase in population, at a regional scale or continental scale, if you will, that's not necessarily the case at all. In fact, we have very good evidence for population declines in certain regions. In Europe, for example, during the second half of the 14th century, or as the case today, as in sub-Saharan Africa during the 18th century, especially at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. So the Atlantic slave trade was obviously of huge geohistorical significance, quite a horrific story, as we all know. This map is relatively as an important map in showing the main flows of enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa or Africa south of the Sahara. Now, as you'll see from this map, it was not simply an Atlantic phenomenon. There was a Middle Eastern, North African slave trade as well. To a certain extent, the slave trade from Africa to the Middle East began earlier and lasted later than the Atlantic slave trade, but was not of the same magnitude, although it was plenty large as well. And you can see that it also extended into islands of the Indian Ocean. You can see the Mascarene Islands here, Réunion, and Mauritius, for example. Sorry, I lost the word there. But these had been previously uninhabited islands that became important centers of sugarcane production, and no surprise, enslaved Africans were brought there. The other important thing you could see on this map that may be kind of surprising is a relatively narrow line to the United States as compared to the lines going to the Caribbean and Brazil, and those lines are representing numbers of enslaved people. And we actually have quite good numbers on this. Here's a much more detailed analysis, breaking it down much further to relatively small scale regions. And you can see by the thickness of the lines that the numbers brought to what is now the United States were not as large as the enslaved peoples who were taken to the Caribbean, Brazil, Northern South America. Now, there are several reasons for this. One was the death rate of people coming from Africa to the tropical regions was higher than it was to the United States. Probably a more important reason, though, was that in the U.S., there was a movement away from purchasing enslaved people from Africa directly and actually producing slaves on plantations. Virginia in particular, many of the plantations specialized in raising people to sell to the main frontier of the slave economy in the U.S. In the Cotton Belt in the South Central region, states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So there are these numbers, as I said before, are well authenticated. Now, there are a lot of enslaved people who were brought to the Americas, to be sure. I don't want to downplay that. But the numbers were much larger to Brazil and the Caribbean. And that's just a larger African population ended up in those regions. It's important to look also at how deadly this slave trade was, the Atlantic slave trade. People were dying at every stage, being captured in Africa on ships, and then once they got to the Americas, Patrick Manning, who has investigated this in great detail, And there's a tremendous amount of archival information on this, quantitative information. And anyway, he estimates that roughly 12 million enslaved people crossed the Atlantic between 1500 and 1850, and about 1.5 million died on those ships. The ships were horrific, overcrowded, inadequate sanitation, brutal treatment, and vast numbers died and were simply thrown off the ship. Manning also estimates that about 4 million died inside Africa. After they were captured, many were captured in the interior, marched to the coast, and there was a high death rate there. Another book, David Stannard's American Holocaust, has some good information on this. He estimates that 50% of African slave trade deaths occurred in Africa as a result of wars between native kingdoms, which produced the majority of slaves. Europeans were not actively capturing people for enslaving them in Africa simply because it was too deadly for them. The average European life expectancy on the African mainland before 1850 was roughly a year. The prevalence of tropical diseases was so great, and the Europeans had so little immunity that staying on the African mainland was generally a death sentence. So what European slave traders would do would be to stay for short periods of time in isolated coastal enclaves, or preferably on an island offshore if they could. Slaves were captured by African states generally, originated from people being enslaved after being defeated in war. But then a noxious dynamic developed where very successful African states needed to acquire European weapons in competition with other states, and to purchase those weapons, the most important trade item they had was human bodies. And so that led to a lot of competition for enslaving people within Africa. And these wars were quite deadly, and it was very difficult to, possible really, to opt out of the system. Also estimated about 35%, this may be exaggerated, but it's pretty high, Africans died in their first year at so-called seasoning camps in the Americas. Had to become used to the disease environment of plantations. But dysentery spread generally by polluted water, very common in crowded and unsanitary situations like these, which would have then resulted in a high death rate as well. So what I want to do today particularly is to look at some of the demographic repercussions for sub-Saharan Africa from this trade. So I have a graphic here from the Coordination of the Slave Route Project. One could look this up to get the information. The map is interesting, but what I really want to focus on is that little inset that I've put a red box around it. Now this is just an estimate, and estimates are going to be different depending on who you consult. But in this particular one, the estimate is that the total African population at the middle of the 19th century, so 1850 or so, was about 100 million, and the estimated total size the African population would have reached by the middle of the 19th century, again 1850, in the absence of the slave trade, around 200 million. So these authors are estimating the potential population of Africa had been cut in half by the depredations of the slave trade. Now, I do not know if this is how accurate this is, but I think essentially all scholars agree that it was a significant reduction of potential population from the depredations of the slave trade. And we can see this on cartograms. So again, a cartogram is a map where constituent units are changed in size and hence in shape depending on some numerical variable, and these are population cartograms. They're based on modern countries, which didn't exist in 1500 or in most cases even 1800, but they're good enough. But the point of this map is you could see the green area on the top map for Africa, and then the sort of reddish area as Africa is depicted on the bottom. And you can just see these are in terms of relative population, relative from one part of the region to the other. I think these are kind of fun maps to look at. For example, on the map on the top especially, look at how Canada is depicted, and the United States as well. Look how much larger what is now Mexico is at that time. But the point is just the reduction in size of Africa, which I think is quite generally accurate. Now there's some mysteries to look at when we contemplate this. One is that areas that exported the most enslaved people are now some of the most densely populated parts of Africa. How do we figure? For example, on the map on the left, you can see areas that these were the ports from which slaves were sent out. And these are just numbers of enslaved people sent from these. And you can see the Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa, what is now southern part of the Republic of Congo, northern part of Angola, a huge area for the slave trade, mostly people destined for Brazil. There were close connections between Portugal and the Kingdom of Congo. Portugal supplied weapons and other goods. Kingdom of Congo, which interestingly, its aristocracy converted to Christianity very early, by the 1500s. Congolese aristocracy. By Congo, I just mean this kingdom, not what is now the two countries called Congo. On the population density map, though, I should have noted it, though. Congo is depicted as what had been the Kingdom of Congo, depicted as a relatively densely populated area, which it is. Much more densely populated than the area just to the north, which gets into the country of Gabon, and to the south as well. What I want to focus a bit more would be what is now Nigeria. On the map on the right, I have put a heavy line around the modern state of Nigeria. On the map on the left, I've also noted the three largest ethnic groups of Nigeria: the Hausa in the north, the Yoruba in the south west, and the Igbo in the southeast. Nigeria has a lot of different ethnic groups, but those are the largest. And you can see all those are areas that are mapped as having exported a lot of enslaved people. Today, these are very densely populated areas. Nigeria is the demographic core of sub-Saharan Africa, 240 million people. That's at least twice as much as the next most populous state, which would be Ethiopia. So the question then comes, well, if so many enslaved people were sent from what is now Nigeria, and the slave trade was so devastating to population, why would Nigeria have such a large population? And then I want to contrast that with an area that is, in the current day, the state of the Central African Republic. You can see it, aptly named, generally in the central part of Africa. If you look on the map on the left, you can see the areas. I didn't outline this region. It's kind of hard to do, but it's not an area depicted as having sent many slaves across the Atlantic at all. But yet this is a very low populated area. It's about the same size as Nigeria, or comparable size anyway. But whereas Nigeria has 240 million people, Central African Republic has about 5.6 million. Now, why is Central African Republic so sparsely populated, especially if it had relatively little role in the slave trade? Well, it's not sparsely populated because of climate. Central African Republic is well south of the Sahara. This is a satellite image, and you can basically see the Sahara and the shades of brown in the north. I've indicated some areas. Although, actually, I should say the Sahara and the Sahel, some of those areas north of the green zone would be seasonally green, depending on how much rain falls in the summertime. But rainfall decreases as you go north on that map, and at the very northern end of it, you are into the Sahara. But I just want to note that Central African Republic is not in this belt at all. It's in what's generally called the tropical wet and dry zone, meaning it's warm or to hot all year. Has a very distinct rainy season in the summertime. It's north of the Sahara, so we're talking June, July, August. Very dry in December, January, February, and so on. But generally gets plenty of rain to support fairly lush savannas, forests and areas, and so on. But yet this area, particularly the zone I've put an oval around, which is both in Central African Republic and on into parts of South Sudan, and a bit of Sudan as well. Excuse me. today has a very sparse population. It's almost uninhabited. Parts of it essentially are uninhabited. And that's an interesting question. Why? Why do so few people live here? Well, of course, it's got a very virulent disease environment, but that's true of areas around it. What's specific about it? Well, it certainly was very heavily raided for slaves in the 19th century, late in the period of the slave trade, early half of the 1800s, essentially. There was one particular ethnic group, the Bobangi people, who had a very important economic niche, if you will, of raiding and enslaving people and selling them. This was done through river systems. They went up the Ubangi River and up into its tributaries into these areas. So they're almost uninhabited today, but they probably had significantly more habitation before the slave raiding commenced. So then the question becomes, well, why was slave raiding so devastating here? It came relatively late, but yet seemed to have had this really important demographic impact. Well, we can't be certain exactly. I'm speculating here more than anything else, but I'm also looking for scholarly information to aid those speculations. And I found this article as from a quarter century ago, Martin Klein, The Slave Trade in Decentralized Society, Journal of African History. But I think it has some really important points to make here. One is that as the slave trade continued over the centuries, slavers moved more into the interior. And this eastern part of Central African Republic is about as interior as you can get in Africa. So it had not been subjected to the slave trade for a long history, and that meant that the people were relatively unprepared to defend themselves. Let me just quote Klein here. So decentralized societies, in other words, societies without a state, organized on kinship networks, village communities, and so on. Decentralized societies usually defended themselves relatively effectively, forcing slavers both to extend their networks further into the interior and to devise new ways of obtaining slaves. Second, agents of the slave trade were often successful in developing linkages within targeted societies that exploited tensions and hostilities. But then the other important information here is at the bottom of the slide, in highlighted areas in East and Central Africa during the 19th century. Slavers were often very effective because they erupted suddenly into societies that had no tradition of defense. So I think that may have been happening, may have been what happened here. Societies that had been insulated from the slave trade had no experience with it, and then they are hit hard and fast and in a devastating manner. So that could be what's going on. It could help explain this sort of seeming mystery of areas that are not mapped as having exported a lot of slaves, but did, because those maps are showing sort of the not where slaves were first captured, but where they were actually exported across the Atlantic from. Okay. Anyway, if we look at current situation, it's quite a difference. As I will talk about it at length. Well, I have talked about it in previous lectures, and we'll talk about it again. Sub-Saharan Africa today has by far the world's highest birth rates and most rapid population growth. Here again we have cartograms, one showing 1800 and another a projection of the world in 75 years from now, 2100. Population stabilizing at 11 billion, may stabilize at a much lower number, but you can just see how large Africa is on that map, how compare it to the size of the Americas or of Europe. And so Africa today would have had a larger population had it not been for the slave trade, but in the future it looks like Africa will return to its sort of more normal position in global demography and then surge ahead of that and become a real center of population. But of course, these are all projections and we don't know what is going to happen. Now, a related topic is the partial repopulation of the tropical Americas by people of African descent. So this map is just showing Afro descendants in Latin America. So if you remember from previous lecture, there had been a huge amount of depopulation in the Americas because of the coming of diseases from Europe and from Africa as well. I focused before on diseases coming from Europe, things like smallpox, measles, and so on. But tropical diseases from Africa were also brought to the Americas, essentially with the slave trade. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever, those are the two most important ones. And once that happened, that resulted in further rounds of depopulation in the Americas. People had no immunity to these very devastating diseases. People from Africa had by no means perfect immunity, but a higher degree of immunity than the indigenous peoples. So anyway, if you look at people in the Americas of African descent, you could see 97 million in Brazil. Now, most of those people are of mixed descent, partly African, partly European, partly indigenous, but a very substantial African imprint on the genetics of the population of Brazil. And not just Brazil, you can see Venezuela, Colombia, throughout the Caribbean. There's an area from northeast Brazil through the coastal region of northern South America, much of the coastal region of Central America, northern South America, throughout the Caribbean, where a majority of the population has substantial, if not almost complete, African ancestry. Much less in places like Chile and Argentina, Peru, but certainly still there. So there's a certain amount of repopulation. Now, this map does not show the United States, so I do want to add that. So about 48 million people in the United States of African descent, generally of mixed. Most African black Americans have some European ancestry and some American Indian ancestry. It varies tremendously by person to person. So you can see that's a pretty substantial number, although much less than Brazil. An interesting issue, a difference, I should say, between Brazil and the United States is how people are categorized, classified, and how they self-identify. So historically in the United States, any African ancestry makes a person black, whereas in Brazil, historically, any European ancestry makes a person brown rather than black. So if you look at race in Brazil, you could see that people who identified as Preto or African, only about 10%. In the United States, about 14.5% of the population self-identifies as black. In Brazil, a much smaller number from a smaller population, about 10%. But the difference is this large Pardo or mixed race or brown category in Brazil. You could see almost half of the population larger than the white population. So these are people of mixed African, European, and indigenous ancestry. So a different way of classifying people. But it is, despite this, important to note there's a much greater proportion of African ancestry, or genes, if you will, in Brazil compared to the United States. If you're interested in this topic of demography, disease, and the Atlantic slave trade, I highly recommend Charles Mann's 1493. This is a sequel to his well-known book 1491, describing the world in the Americas before Columbus, and then this describes not just the Americas, but the entire world and how it was changed by the Columbian exchange of plants and animals, of diseases, and integrating the world's land masses and movement of people, animals, plants, diseases around the world. One of the points that Mann makes, I think it's a powerful, somewhat controversial point, is that one of the reasons why plantations in the Americas turned to enslaved labor rather than using alternative free labor, or whatever you want to call it, had to do with demography and disease. So the initial movements to create plantations in many Caribbean islands and even in the United States used indentured servants from Europe. These were poor Europeans who were not enslaved, but were sort of quasi-enslaved for a certain amount of time because they had to pay off their transportation and the food they received, and so they had to work for many years to get their freedom. This was quite exploitative, although not as exploitative as outright slavery. But there was a real movement away from this towards African slaves. And one of the reasons Mann explains is because Africans had partial resistance to these tropical diseases that had come to the Americas. And so they would simply survive and be healthy, survive longer and be healthier than Europeans. Even the European plantation owners had real problems in the Caribbean with tropical diseases, and had a pretty high death rate. The fact that they were willing to do it with this sort of threats to their health and life do indicate also how profitable that was. So there are a number of tropical diseases involved here, but by far the two most important are malaria and yellow fever. So just a few words about malaria. Found throughout, actually initially found through most of the eastern hemisphere, even into quite northern areas. We think today of malaria as a tropical disease, and it is much more virulent in the tropics, but it has historically been found, we can see on this map, through most of Europe and East Asia, and it's a very wide area. So the map shows green areas that were formerly malarial. I think a lot of the areas that it is mapping as unstable. Malaria has now been eradicated. For example, in southwestern India, the state of Kerala, I don't think there's any malaria there. And so the map is probably a little out of date. What is important, though, is the Western Hemisphere, malaria had not been present anywhere here. It was brought in with the Columbian Exchange and spread very rapidly, especially in tropical areas, and it's now quite well established in the Amazon and many other zones. It is also important to note, though, that malaria is not just one kind of disease. There are a variety of different forms. The most important would be falciparum in red and vivax in blue. You can see with these pie charts. The falciparum is by far the most deadly. Vivax, which was the one that was formerly found in much of Europe and much of what is now the United States, is characterized by seasonal fevers and chills, debilitating, reducing longevity, but rarely killing one person outright. There are many areas that were very well known as malarial zones. A lot of places in the Mediterranean, if you look at earlier population patterns, you'd see in many areas the immediate coastal zone was often, in many places, was a very low population because it was so malarial. That was true of even the area around Rome. I don't know exactly when it became malarial. It wasn't in ancient times, but there was a movement, population more into hill country, which were less malarial. So lowland, swampy areas, marshy areas. Another classic case would be the fens of eastern England, marshy area, infamous for its chills and fevers. It was a highly malarial lowland area, a lot of mosquitoes. So anyway, it's the areas with those red areas in the pie chart with falciparum, which is a much more deadly form of malaria that is the biggest problem today, and that caused the most deaths during the Atlantic slave trade. Yellow fever also was introduced in the Columbian Exchange. It's interesting today. It's essentially found in northern South America and much of tropical Africa. Not all of it, but much of it. It's spread by a different mosquito. Malaria is spread by Anopheles. Aedes is the genus of the yellow fever mosquito. It's interesting that mosquito has a much broader range than yellow fever. If I remember correctly, it's found through much of Asia where yellow fever hasn't spread, but perhaps potentially could, but it's certainly spread to the Americas. And it became a real threat even in the United States. There were yellow fever outbreaks in a number of U.S. cities. Philadelphia particularly was hit several times. Summertime was a sort of season of sickness in much of the United States. Wealthier people would try to to go to areas with more salubrious climates. But both malaria and yellow fever were big threats. And yellow fever is something that will, as often as not, will kill somebody outright, very high death rate. And yet, New Orleans was a particular problem here. You can see New Orleans there with a red circle, noting yellow fever striking from the 1700s to the 1900s. So it lasted longer and was more virulent probably in New Orleans than anywhere else. There's been some really interesting work on New Orleans. Here's an article from the NPR. It's looking at a work of history called Necropolis, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But I thought this would be a good slide to begin with. I like the quotation. New Orleans in the 19th century was a bit like Silicon Valley today. It is a place where if you were an ambitious white man, you went to make your fortune, but first you had to prove you weren't going to die. Or to continue, examples of Irish immigrants literally seeking to get themselves sick with yellow fever just to give themselves an edge in what is otherwise a very competitive job market. So New Orleans was particularly important because it was a port city on the Mississippi River, and so riverborne traffic, and before the railroad age, most trade was by river carriage, all the way down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River. You come to a port in New Orleans, and that's the sort of window of the central part of the United States, the outside world. Not the only one. You had the Erie Canal connecting New York to the Great Lakes, and so that was important as well. But New Orleans was a boom town. The United States acquired it from France with the Louisiana Purchase. And it was a relatively large city, and it continued to grow, but it also had this just incredibly high death rate. So black people wouldn't die in quite such large numbers, although they certainly suffered as well. But for a white person going to New Orleans, your chance of dying of yellow fever was something on the order of 50%. So anyway, Catherine Oliverius is the author of this book, Necropolis, Disease, Power, and Capitalism in the Cotton Kingdom. She is a historian at Stanford University. I've talked to her about this many times. It's a highly celebrated book. I think this book has won more academic book awards than any book I know of. Very interesting. But anyway, she's coined this term immunocapital, meaning kind of capital or advantage one gets from acquiring immunity. So catching yellow fever and surviving meant one became immune to yellow fever. That meant that you'd have many job opportunities. If you came to New York without this immunity, people would be in New Orleans, people would be reluctant to hire you because they knew chances are you're going to get sick, and 50% chance or so that you're going to die. But once you get this immunity, then you have this advantage, and you could do very, very well. Oliverius also notes that for enslaved blacks, the story was different. Immunity protected them from yellow fever, but as embodied capital-owned people, in other words, they saw the social and monetary value of their acclamation accrue to their white owners. Yes, indeed. So anyway, that's all I have on this topic, but it's an important issue about both the depopulation of Africa, the repopulation of the Americas, and the creation of an Afro-American synthesis in cultural terms, social terms, even genetic terms, whatever you will, through a very large swath of the Americas, particularly those regions that were most highly susceptible to mosquito vector diseases, malaria, and yellow fever. So all these interesting and important issues come together. So thank you. That's all I have for today. The next lecture will be a bit more theoretical, and we'll look at Malthus and Malthusianism and the whole issue surrounding that. Thank you.